Inflation, to be sure, is no good for anyone. Poor people hate to see higher prices for a loaf of bread or a bag of rice, as much as the rich hate to see a smaller dividend check. But studies have consistently demonstrated that economies can withstand moderate levels of inflation, even as high as 50% annually, with no adverse impact on growth or jobs. To a worker, lowering inflation is a Pyrrhic victory if it costs you and your neighbors your paychecks. Preoccupied with inflation, but unconcerned about the jobs climate, Milton Friedman and his coterie of advisors from the University of Chicago coaxed Pinochet in 1974 to fix the exchange rate of the Chilean currency at about 1.4 pesos to the US dollar. Within 2 years, the country's jobless rate had climbed to 35%. Pinochet dismantled the fixed exchange rate, known as a peg, and Chile switched to an exchange rate that allowed the central bank to adjust the currency's value frequently. Maintaining a healthy equilibrium between inflation and unemployment with a slightly undervalued currency has helped Chile's economy grow faster than any other in Latin America since 1990, and China's grow faster than any in the history of the world over that same span. China's central bank adjusts the value of its currency, the yuan, daily to keep inflation at moderate levels while keeping Chinese products a good bargain on the world market. With a mounting trade deficit and borrowing heavily from foreign donors to buy the dollars needed to prop up the peso, government officials in Argentina decided in 2001 that the country could no longer sustain its one-to-one peg and devalued the peso as Chile had done more than 20 years previously. The difference was that the United States and international lenders helped bail Chile out of its immediate jam, but offered no such assistance to Argentina. Argentines saw 2/3 of their savings disappear overnight, and afraid that they would lose it all, tried to withdraw all of their funds at once, triggering a run on the banks like the one that had followed the 1929 stock market crash and led to the Great Depression. When her Buenos Aires bank would not allow her to withdraw even a portion of her life savings, one woman set herself afire in its lobby. Getting the money wrong, as the Argentine economist Alan Sibels says, is globalization's most lethal poison. The surest way to stop any economy, rich or poor, in its tracks. Argentina's inflexible 19th century approach to combating inflation underscores how laissez-faire capitalism is anything but, and proponents of such strategies often misrepresent critics of globalization as protectionist. With few exceptions, globalization's critics do not question whether countries should engage in international trade, only how. Inflation is immaterial if you don't have any money to spend, said Mark Weisbrot, an economist with the Center for Economic Policy, a Washington, D.C. bank-based think tank. But you can see how the average bondholder might not be as invested in how high unemployment rates climb. If they were honest, they'd tell you that they just don't want unemployment to go so high that there is civil unrest, because that can jeopardize their investment even more than inflation. Globalization choked off economic growth to get inflation under control. We've allowed the financial sector to unilaterally determine economic policy for the rest of us. Followed to its logical conclusion, this policy of appeasing speculators has culminated in an all but unregulated banking industry in the United States and the housing crisis that almost crushed the global financial markets under a mountain of bad mortgage debt in 2008. Nixon abandoned the gold standard in 1971, which, like Argentina's monetary policy, caused money supply to contract, but which used gold rather than the US dollar as the peg. A decade later, Ronald Reagan entered the White House intent on restoring the value of the dollar through market interventions, such as aggressively buying back Treasury notes. Clinton's first secretary, the investment banker Robert Rubin, continued to boost the dollar, driving up its price by nearly 30% against the value of the United States trading partners. That worked effectively as a 30% tax on exports and a 30% subsidy for imports, punishing domestic manufacturers. But Clinton went even further in servicing Wall Street's whims. In 1999, demolishing the New Deal era legislation that was a firewall separating investment banks and depositors' cash in commercial banks. Suddenly, commercial banks were free to make loans to practically anyone with a pulse because investment banks were climbing over one another to take the debt, bundled into complex securities, off their hands. It was 1928 again until it wasn't. When Wall Street's accumulation of trillions of dollars in bad debt deterred banks from extending credit in the summer of 2008, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, a Goldman Sachs man, and Congress stepped in to use taxpayer money to buy the bad loans at market price. Unlike the New Deal's response to the financial crisis of the day, neither Paulson nor Congress offered refinancing or relief to homeowners who could not afford to pay the fraudulent loans with exorbitant interest rates, nor did they offer to recapitalize banks by purchasing on behalf of taxpayers preferred shares in the troubled Wall Street firms that could pay dividends down the road. In the game of global finance, ordinary working people are the suckers more than ever. And for them, the financiers and their bagman in Washington have nothing but contempt. This constant reworking of the rules to favor capital has changed Argentina's essential character, demolishing what was once the continent's safest and most prosperous country, just as deftly as a team of bulldozers. For most of the 20th century, Argentina was both ridiculed and envied by its Latin American neighbors. With its august theaters and bookish cafes, Buenos Aires was regarded by many of its continental neighbors as a smug European outpost, the Paris of the global south. On a continent where the chasm between rich and poor is wider than anywhere in the world, 8 out of every 10 Argentines were middle class as recently as 1990. For the 40 years that immediately followed the end of World War II, workers and their bosses split the nation's income exactly in half. Wages accounted for 50% of the gross domestic product, profits the other half. When voters went to the polls in 1946 and elected their former labor minister, General Juan Perón, as president, they ushered in an era of prosperity that was both unprecedented and unrivaled in the Southern Hemisphere. Perón may have borne an eerie resemblance to Boris Karloff, and he had an unnerving fetish for fascists, but he created the modern industrial state in Argentina, nationalizing key industries, spending heavily on healthcare and education, subsidizing agriculture and public works. Between 1946 and 1990, the number of Argentines living in poverty did not eclipse 5%. The national unemployment rate never climbed higher than 6%. 3 of every 4 workers belonged to a labor union. Whatever Argentines wanted or needed, cars, televisions, candy, shoes, Argentine factories and employees assembled it, bottled it, shipped it, repaired it. With the Cold War winding down and Argentina emerging from La Guerra Sucia, the dirty war between the country's conservative military junta and leftist dissidents, voters went to the polls in 1989 and elected a flamboyant Ferrari driving attorney who was the darling of Wall Street and Capitol Hill. Before the second of his 2 5-year terms ended, Carlos Menem's administration had given birth to a new nation. By the time he left office in 1999, this virtually all-white country bore a stark resemblance to some doppelganger American slum.